Alrighty, so today we are hitting Genesis chapters 40 and 41. So if you've got your Bibles, you can go ahead and turn to Genesis 40. Just as a little bit of a recap, we've talked the last couple of weeks about the book of Genesis as a big picture story and how we are following this story of Genesis where we are looking for this seed of Adam or this descendant of the woman of Adam and Eve. And then ultimately that goes into the descendant of Abraham that is promised. There was going to be a royal descendant through whom all the nations of the world would be blessed. So that is going to come at some point as a descendant of Abraham. And we know big picture, and if you do your Bible study, you understand the ultimate royal descendant through whom all the nations would be blessed is Jesus. That's right. So Jesus is the descendant of Abraham that we are looking forward to. But we do see in the book of Genesis that there is a partial fulfillment of this coming. We start to see hints of this coming. And so even though we're still ultimately looking forward to Jesus, we're starting to see some hints of this, that it might come in this narrative that is really the sons of Jacob narrative, but that we know of as the Joseph narrative. So the narrative really has narrowed in on two sons of Jacob, Joseph and Judah. We worked through some stories with both Joseph and Judah last week, where we saw Judah's character was very leaving much to be desired. Judah is not a good character at the beginning of the Joseph narrative. He does a lot of terrible things. But then we start to see maybe his character have a significant moment where he's turning a little bit at the end of chapter 38. And then in 39, we see Joseph is much higher character. Joseph is the one that is resisting temptation. Joseph is the one who is honoring the Lord in how he lives. Now, I want to jump backwards for just a moment, because the things that we're going to see here in chapters 40 and 41 are connected to this bigger story of the Joseph narrative. And so I want to remind you of what we saw at the beginning of the class, and that was two dreams and a pit. This was in Genesis chapter 37. We have this story of Joseph, who at the very least is not socially aware, and he tells all his dreams to his brothers, and they get really jealous of him. He has two dreams here whenever he's living with his father and his brothers. And these two dreams are, one of them is based on grain, and there's stalks of grain that are bowing down to him, and the interpretation of that is his brothers are going to bow down to him, that Joseph is going to be this royal figure who his brothers are bowing down to. And then the second dream is basically the same, but it uses stars, and the sun and the moon are all bowing down to Joseph. And so again, you've got that royal imagery, but that obviously doesn't play well with his brothers. And yet, through Genesis 37 and even his brothers ending up betraying him, selling him into slavery, doing terrible things, lying about him to their father, through all of that, we talked last week about how God was doing something good. Even though his brothers were doing evil things, even though his brothers were wrong in selling him into slavery, we're going to see later that Joseph says, God sent me to Egypt. God was doing this, not you. So even in the times whenever things were unfair and when people were sinning against him and when it seemed like all hope was lost, God was still doing something good in it. And we can find hope in that. That's an encouraging thing. So then we saw in chapter 39, he goes to the house of Potiphar. Everything seems to be going well for a while, and then he's falsely accused and he's sent to prison. It seemed like a glimpse of what God was doing good, and then everything just seemed to be crashing down. And now he finds himself in a prison that he's going to describe as a pit later in the narrative. So it feels to Joseph like he is in the same spot that he was whenever his brothers threw him into the pit. Now he's right back down into that pit, as if the house of Potiphar hadn't ever happened. Now we get to Genesis 40 and 41, and this week we are going to see that God has a plan God is doing something good, but we're also going to see that God has a pace. God is doing something good, and often his timing looks a lot different than our timing. So, big picture of what I want us to see today is that we need to not only trust God's plan, but we also need to trust God's pace, even whenever things aren't going to the timing that we would plan for ourselves. So we have to be willing to work for God, but we also have to be willing to wait for God and be willing to take this time to honor him in the waiting. And I do think that we're going to see frequently in this that the key to waiting well in God's plan at God's pace is humility. When we humble ourselves under the plan of God and recognizing God is doing something good, and we humble ourselves to allow him to work his plan at his own pace. So that's a big, long intro, but let's get into Genesis chapter 40. Let's go ahead and read some of the first verses here in Genesis 40, starting in verse 1. It says, sometime after this, so this is Joseph was thrown into the prison, and then sometime after this. That could be a long time, right? Sometime. He's been in the prison for a while now. He's been put in charge of his fellow prisoners by the leader of the prison there, and he's staying still, even though he's in charge of people, he's in a prison, which is not a great deal for him. So sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was very angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody, and one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with his own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody and in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" And they said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." So here in the prison, we see now two dreams in a prison. We're going to see this pattern of two dreams happening, and we are seeing in this that God is working his plan all the way from the two dreams in a pit that were happening in Joseph's life, and even all the way before that. He's working his plan from Abraham, that he is preparing this offspring. But it says sometime after this, good time after Joseph has been in the prison, he's been there long enough that the captain of the guard trusts him. Interesting thing here, in chapter 39, Potiphar is described as the captain of the guard. And then here in chapter 40, it says that it's the captain of the guard who's putting these guys in the custody of Joseph. Now, people think different things about who is this captain of the guard. Is this a different captain of the guard now since Potiphar? Or is Potiphar still trusting Joseph with stuff? Has Potiphar put Joseph in the prison and now he's giving him responsibilities still? That would seem a little bit weird. Some people think it's because, well, Potiphar didn't really trust his wife and he thinks she was lying, but he kind of had to put Joseph in prison because of how it would look. I don't know if that's the case. Either way here, we know that Joseph shouldn't be in the prison right now. And the only way for him to get out of the prison is someone who ranks higher than the captain of the guard of the king of Egypt. Someone who is higher than the captain of the guard has to get him out, which doesn't seem very hopeful for Joseph. But we see God working his plan as he puts Joseph, first of all, with the right people. So he puts Joseph in this prison with the chief cupbearer and his baker. Now, this seems like it's the cupbearer of Pharaoh and the baker of Pharaoh. Some people think it's the cupbearer of Pharaoh and the cupbearer's baker. I don't think that makes a whole lot of sense, but I think it is the cupbearer of Pharaoh and the baker of Pharaoh. And that seems like, okay, two servants of Pharaoh, right? Two people who, they're kind of low-level people around Pharaoh. That's not the case. That is not who the cupbearer and the baker are. If you think about who gets closest to an ancient king? Who has the most access to an ancient king? Well, the person who's holding his drink and the person who's making his food, right? These are two of the most trusted people in Pharaoh's inner circle. These are the people who, this guy could easily put poison in the cup of the king. This guy could easily put poison in the food of the king. These are people that Pharaoh would have had close to his inner circle. In fact, the description of a cupbearer and a baker in the ancient world often is synonymous with a close advisor. These are people who are in the inner circles of Pharaoh himself. So God is putting Joseph with people who are in some way close to Pharaoh. Now, obviously, it says they've offended Pharaoh and they've been put in prison, so maybe they're not super useful right now, but they are people who live and work in the inner circles of Pharaoh himself. Now, as we just think about the sovereignty of God and God working his plan and doing something good in all this, think about all the things that had to go right to put Joseph with these people. That Joseph had to have been given responsibility in the prison in order to be a person that might be put in charge of these people. Joseph had to find favor in the sight of the captain of the guard. Joseph had to end up being sold into Potiphar's house and end up being falsely accused by Potiphar's wife in order for him to be in this place that these two guys end up in prison. All of this is a plan that Joseph would not have put together for himself. But all of these things God is putting together to put him specifically with the right people at the right time. And God is putting Joseph in the right situation. So in verses 5 through 8, you see they have these dreams. And I want you to consider this as well. They didn't have to have these dreams. These dreams didn't have to happen. These dreams are future-telling dreams that are coming from God himself. God is showing himself to these people and showing the future to these people for a purpose. And if those dreams never happen, then Joseph is not in the right situation. He's never going to get out of this prison. None of this is going to help him in the long run. But God is putting him in a situation where now this guy who has been known to have had dreams and God is with him in the prison, now he is in the right situation to where he can speak into these people's lives. God is orchestrating all of this to put it in the perfect situation for him. So, and the fact that dreams are coming back into the picture here makes us think maybe God's not quite done with those dreams that Joseph had way back in chapter 37. Maybe God's not done with this idea that his brothers come to bow before him. So, just a little application point off of this that we see from Joseph is that we ought to humble ourselves to be God's servant wherever he puts us. Joseph here responds to the dreams. Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. Joseph, even in this prison that he should not be in, he is humbling himself as a servant of God and living as a servant of God and being an instrument for God's plan in this place. So Joseph gives credit to God. He knows that everything he has is from God, including his interpretations. Now, we're going to talk about interpreting dreams in this story, and I just want to say there is a big kind of subculture of Christianity out there that is really interested in dreams and how do we interpret dreams. There's books out there with symbols of dreams and how you're supposed to interpret them. So if you dream this, here's what this means. You can go through the table. These are the images that were in your dream. It's telling you this. And they've made it almost like a science of like this is how you're supposed to interpret your dream. That's not what the Joseph narrative is displaying here. Joseph repeatedly, both here and later in chapter 41, says interpretations belong to God. It's not that Joseph knows the symbols and knows like how you're supposed to put together all of these things. Joseph is simply relying on God showing him what it is that these dreams mean. So any of that kind of looking at, oh, well, I had this dream and it had this tree and then there was a fruit and then this happens. And so someone puts all those together and gives you an interpretation like it's a math problem. That's not how the Bible teaches us about dreams. The Bible teaches us that God is the one that gives interpretations to dreams. But humbling yourself wherever God puts you, whatever home God puts you in, whatever city, whatever job, whatever situation God puts you in, we are called to humble ourselves before him as his servant, to give him credit for everything that we're doing, saying that everything belongs to him, and serve the way that he would have us serve. So Joseph gives credit to God, and he opens himself up to be used where he is. Let's see what he says about these dreams. Verse 9 says, the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Then Joseph said to him, this is the interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly, when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit. So Joseph interprets this dream and says, in 3 days, cupbearer is once again going to be in the inner circle of Pharaoh. He's going to be back in that spot, that high position of a trusted advisor of Pharaoh. And so Joseph realizes how important that is. Notice what he says. He says, remember me, because you are going to have the ear of Pharaoh. You are going to be there. You can make a difference. One person who does rank higher than the captain of the guard is the Pharaoh, the king of all of Egypt. So, remember me whenever you show up there. He realizes this might be his ticket out. So the baker is over here thinking, well, that's great, right? The cupbearer is going to get to go back. Let me tell you my dream. This is going to be awesome. Verse 16, when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it and out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered and said, this is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. Wah, wah, wah. That's not what the baker was hoping for. And you see that it's comical wordplay that it uses here, that he's going to lift up your head, just like the cupbearer. He's going to lift up your head and show favor, but no, he's going to lift up your head from you. I just think it's funny how he words it, but Joseph is ultimately what Joseph is doing, though, is speaking from God's revelation. Even though this was not a happy interpretation to give like the cupbearer was, Joseph is just obediently telling the truth of what this means. So then what happens next? Verse 20, on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. So everything happened exactly as Joseph said. This is Joseph's chance to get out. This is going to be great. The cupbearer's right there with Pharaoh. But the cupbearer did not remember him. He forgot him. And it's based on the word forgot here in Hebrew, it might have been that he forgot, it slipped his mind. But also, this was 3 days later, which seems kind of strange that he would have, forgotten. You could translate this as he did not remember Joseph, in terms of he didn't choose to show favor to Joseph. He simply chose to not talk about Joseph in front of Pharaoh for one reason or another here. And what happens next in verse 1 of 41? After 2 whole years. So this happens, and cupbearer goes out, and Joseph doesn't hear anything. Day after day after day after day for 2 entire years. Think about how long 2 years is if you're waiting on something and you're clueless. Joseph is blind at this point. He's sitting there in the prison. He doesn't know, is the cupbearer ever going to say anything? I mean, I imagine after a month or two, I'm probably like, oh, well, that would have been a great opportunity, but it didn't happen. 2 whole years happens, and we know that God's plan has to be working at this point, but his pace seems so slow. And Joseph waits, and he waits, and he waits. And an application that comes out of this is for us to humble ourselves to be God's servant as long as he leaves us there. Where we have to humble himself wherever he puts us, and as long as we stay there. And sometimes it's difficult when we don't know that end point. When we're in a situation, in a place, in a job, in a circumstance that is unfavorable towards us and we don't know the end point. It's easy to look back in our lives and be like, oh yeah, God was doing something good. But often in the moment, it's hard to look forward in our lives and say, I don't know when this is going to end, but God is doing something good here. We don't know what's coming next, but we should ask the question, how is God giving me the opportunity to serve him now? Even in the prison, even under the leadership of the captain of the guard where I should not be, how is God calling me to serve him now? Because what we see happen next is not only was God's plan working, but his pace was exactly right. The timing that he was using was exactly what it needed to be. So let's look in any questions so far while we're in chapter 40 before we jump into 41. Yes. One thing I forgot to say there, consider cupbearer and baker, what do they deal with? They deal with food and drink, and we're about to see 2 more dreams that are very interested in food and drink, that are interested in famine, that the food and the drink is going to be now taken away. And also what was in Joseph's first dream, grain. So you see this kind of theme running through all of these dreams that it's going to culminate in chapter 41. So chapter 41, let's read. It says, verse 1, after 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed on the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows. And Pharaoh awoke, and he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump ears. And Pharaoh woke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. So, here now we see 2 dreams in a palace. And Pharaoh has these dreams. He freaks out about them. For some reason, he is more troubled by these dreams than any other dream that someone might have. He tries to get someone to interpret them, but he has no one to explain them. Now, I think we should draw a connection here. If you are familiar with bigger picture in the Bible, we see a very similar story to this happening elsewhere. Anyone know elsewhere in the Bible where this happens? This king has this dream, can't find anyone to interpret it. Daniel, that's right. So I mentioned in our first class that we're going to see connections with Daniel and that this is a very similar story. And the same thing happens with Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel here. But the one difference in that story is Nebuchadnezzar is a jerk, and he doesn't even tell them what the dream was. He just says, you got to tell me the dream and its interpretation. That doesn't happen in Joseph. But you read these stories side by side, and they are strikingly similar. It is incredible the parallels that happen between these two things. And some people think, and I tend to agree with them, that there is an intentional paralleling in the Bible of Daniel to Joseph. Now, some people would say Daniel's a fake story that is made up and written to be paralleled with Joseph. I don't think that. That is not what I believe. I think God ordains Daniel's life to look very similar to Joseph's life for a few reasons. I think that he is trying to make this connection clear with Joseph, and the reason I threw my book back here is I wanted to just point out some of the connections that you can see between these things. So first, both characters are Jews living in exile. Joseph and Daniel, they're both living in exile. Both are enlisted to serve government officials. Joseph and Daniel are the only Jews able to interpret dreams. Fourth, the scripture describes both characters as handsome in the narrative. For some reason, it tells us how both of them are handsome. Fifth, both are given new names by their captors. Sixth, both characters are presented as models of faithfulness and piety. You never see them fail. They both just are, they resist temptation. They resist the influence of the people that are their captors. Seventh, both find favor before their superiors. Eighth, both are characterized by great wisdom, which is recognized by their captors. Ninth, both men serve in foreign court for 93 years. Weird, right? Like that's a very specific number, but they do. And then there's all sorts of correspondences in how they describe these stories as well. You can't see it, but this is a whole table of, on the right hand, it's things that are said in the Joseph narrative, and on the left, it's the exact same thing that's said in the Daniel narrative. These things, I really believe these are intentionally made to parallel one another, and what they're trying to say in that is Daniel is being portrayed as a sort of new Joseph for these people of Israel who are in exile. So with Joseph, Joseph came to be seen as this example of God preserving his people and then ultimately having a plan to bring them up out of Egypt. Even Joseph here being brought up out of the prison is foreshadowing what would happen of the people being brought up out of the house of Egypt. And Daniel then is presented to the people in exile with the story of Daniel as this new Joseph after whom the Exodus would be accomplished. They would be brought home from this exile. So I think that the parallels here between Daniel and Joseph are really significant, not only because it's going to happen in Daniel's life very much like in Joseph's life, that after Daniel, the people are going to be brought back to the land of Canaan or the land of Israel, but also looking forward to what we see in the life of Jesus. That in Jesus, God's people are going to be brought out of their exile. And so I think there's parallels happening through the Bible here that are pointing us to a bigger picture story that is important for us. Any questions on that? Okay, so the cupbearer, 2 years later, ends up remembering Joseph. How convenient. It's great. Verse 9, the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. Now, that's interesting. His offenses. What is he talking about? Is he talking about when he offended Pharaoh? Maybe. But what it says in chapter 40 is that they committed an offense against Pharaoh. Is he talking about maybe it's his offense against Pharaoh and also his offense against Joseph, that he had forgotten Joseph and that he had not kept his word to mention him? But either way, I remember my offenses today when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. So, remember, God had put Joseph with the right people in the right situation. Now he is putting him in this perfect situation. And application that comes out of this is that we ought to humble ourselves to know that God's plan is better than our plan. If you had asked Joseph his opinion about how his life should go, this ain't it. Like, this is not how he would have done things. And yet God was doing it the exact way that he needed to. Consider this. Think about this. What if the cupbearer had remembered Joseph immediately? What if he shows up in Pharaoh's presence and he says, look, Pharaoh, there was this crazy thing that happened. I had this dream. The baker had this dream. And this Hebrew guy that was there told us exactly what would happen. And boom, it happened exactly like it happened. It was amazing. What do you think happens? I mean, a couple of things. Maybe Pharaoh's like, okay, cool. That's all right. You just give me my wine. Or maybe Pharaoh's really impressed by that, and he lets Joseph out of prison, and that would be great, and Joseph goes his merry way. But instead, what's happening now, 2 years later, after all of that waiting that Joseph had to do, now the cupbearer is remembering this at the perfect time when Pharaoh is desperate for exactly what Joseph has to offer. Where Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, wants someone to interpret a dream. If he had done this 2 years ago, then Pharaoh might have not had a second thought about it. It's okay. But now, 2 years later, God has put Joseph in the perfect situation to where Pharaoh is desperate for exactly what Joseph has to offer. So what Pharaoh does is he quickly calls him up out of the prison. He says, verse 14, Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit, which is an interesting way that it describes the prison where he was. It was the pit. And it says, when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. So what have I said about Joseph's clothes? Keep an eye on Joseph's clothes. Before, his clothes were ripped off of him, and he was cast into the pit. Now he comes up out of the pit, and he is allowed to change his clothes. You also see him shave, which is interesting. The Hebrews were known for having beards and being bearded people. Egyptians were known for shaving and being clean-shaven all over the place. So what Joseph does here, he becomes more Egyptian. He makes himself look very much like an Egyptian. Now they know he's a Hebrew. The cupbearer already said this is a Hebrew slave. But he does make himself kind of presentable to the Egyptian Pharaoh here. And that it adds to a reason why maybe later whenever Joseph's brothers show up, they don't recognize him, and they don't even think, oh, who could that be? Because he looks like an Egyptian. He's all shaved. He's very much embraced the Egyptian look here. And so they probably just don't recognize him later. But he comes up, he changes his clothes. In verse 15, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream, and there's no one who can interpret it. I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And Joseph said to Pharaoh, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. So once again, same thing here. Joseph is pointing back to God. And I think we learn here as well, we should humble ourselves so that God gets all the glory for what he does through you. Joseph could have said, yeah, it's crazy how I can interpret these dreams. It's awesome. Tell me the dream. But instead he says, no. Interpretations don't come from me. I don't have this roadmap of how to interpret a dream. I have God with me, and he is the one who's able to do this through me. So Pharaoh retells the dream, and he asks Joseph to explain it. I'm not going to read through it because he basically tells it the same way, except there's one little tweak, and when he's describing the thin cows and the blighted wheat, he uses more extreme adjectives. And it seems like Pharaoh's getting more and more concerned about what this dream could mean and the fact that no one can interpret it. He seems to be intensifying the dreams that like this sounds worse than it could be. But down in verse 25, Joseph says to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he has what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are 1. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. So, Joseph gives this detailed explanation. You've got 7 years of abundant blessing. They're going to have more than they could possibly need, and then 7 years of extreme famine and struggle, so much so that those first 7 years will be completely forgotten because of the famine that follows. Now, notice what he says about these dreams. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. So, number one, the dreams are from God. God is revealing. He's also saying what God is about to do to Egypt. God is about to bring about this time of blessing, and God is about to bring about this time of famine. We should recognize in this, first of all, that God is at work both in blessing and in disaster in our lives. God is always doing something good. Sometimes in the moment, it's hard to see what God is doing is good. He's always doing good, but at times he is bringing about disaster. He's saying, I'm going to give you this blessing. I'm also going to bring about this famine where people aren't going to have the food that they need. And that can be hard to grasp. It's really difficult to understand. How can God be in charge when disasters happen? Famine here is a natural disaster as we would think of it. We think about hurricanes, we think about tornadoes, think about flooding. That's what famine is here. This is some sort of natural disaster that's keeping food away. And how is it that God can bring a disaster like that about and be in control and still be a good God? It's difficult for us to understand, and a lot of people, that is a reason why they don't want to believe in God. It's because they see the disasters around the world and they say, how could a good God possibly bring something like that about? And I think there's no answer that just says, oh, well, that makes total sense. I'm good to go. This makes me feel completely better about all of it. But I do think that part of an answer can be found in how we humble ourselves under God's plan at God's pace. Remember, we've been talking about recognizing God's doing something good, and wherever he's put me, he has a plan, and for however long he's put me there, he has a pace, and we need to humble ourselves underneath that, and it helps us to understand that God is doing something good even in these things. Think about the story of Job. In the story of Job, what resolution does God give to Job at the end? Does God say, okay, I did this, like I let this happen, I let Satan come and do all of these things for this reason, this reason, this reason, this reason. This is a good this is why you lost all your kids, this is why you lost all your money, this is why you lost all your health. Does he give any of that explanation? No. What's he say? Basically, I'm God and you're not. Like, that's the explanation that he gives. He helps Job to recognize, where were you when I spoke everything into existence? You weren't there. Where were you whenever I did this and this and this? He's telling Job, look, I'm God. I know best. I am allowed to do what is best. And you are not God. And you need to humble yourself and put yourself in the place as a creation underneath the wise plan of God. Now, a lot of the time we don't love that idea. We don't like humbling ourselves under the plan of God. But we need to recognize, even each of us, we don't deserve another breath on this earth. We are sinners who have rebelled against God. We are the ones who took God's glorious creation and we turned it over and tried to make gods out of ourselves. We are the ones who rejected God's will. We are the ones who brought sin into this world. And now so often we turn to God and we try to blame it on him. And we try and say, why would you do this to us? And yet we are the ones that are rebelling against his will. And we are the ones who are not living our lives for him. We go on living our lives so often without any regard for what pleases him, and then we get upset with God when he doesn't do what pleases us, which just completely flips things on their heads. So understanding God's sovereignty and his power over suffering and death, there's not an easy answer to it, but I do think it helps for us to humble ourselves and recognize, put it in perspective of how God is working his good plan at his good pace. And don't forget the other thing that this shows us, that God is revealing himself to Pharaoh, what God is about to do, shows us the fact that God shows us grace by showing us himself. God could leave us in the disaster. God could have said nothing about the famine that was about to come. And yet God showed grace in revealing himself and what he was about to do. Because of that, God preserved all sorts of life in that. And so recognizing, yes, God is bringing this disaster, but he's also showing so much grace by revealing himself to us. Despite our sin and our unfaithfulness, God reveals himself so that death doesn't have to win. And that is the same in Jesus. Jesus is the revelation of God to us. Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. He is the radiance of the glory of God who has come to reveal God to us so that death doesn't have to win, so that we don't have to face the disaster. We don't have to face the famine. We can have salvation because God showed himself to us in Christ. That is a grace that we shouldn't forget. Now, here God reveals himself to Pharaoh and offers the solution to his problem in his servant Joseph. So Joseph, in verse 33, doesn't wait for Pharaoh's response to the interpretation. Joseph says, here's what I would do about it. Like he goes ahead and he gives the suggestion of what's coming next. So verse 33, therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. And I think Joseph is being sarcastic. I think Joseph is like, all those wise men you got over there, those wise guys that couldn't tell you anything about that dream, you need to set one of them over your kingdom. I think there's some sarcasm here that he's pointing out. Ultimately, he's not explicitly offering himself as the ticket out, but I think he kind of is, recognizing that the wise men aren't all that wise. So he says, verse 34, let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. Let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. So, again, we see God's plan unfolding really through Joseph as the one who is going to be able to save Egypt. So, just like that, you've got this Hebrew slave, this prisoner, who is not even supposed to be in the prison. He's not even supposed to be in Egypt, but now he's about to be elevated to the heights of power in the most powerful nation of Egypt. So this proposal, verse 37, pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot. And they called out before him, bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name, who knows? And I didn't try to, that's Egyptian. I don't know Egyptian. And he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, a priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. So in the last 2 weeks, we've seen God working his plan, and here we see God's plan unfolds at just the right time. Joseph's brought up out of the pit. Remember Joseph's clothes? Here he's clothed in fine linen again. It's a reverse of what is happening in Genesis 37. He's given jewelry. He's now put in charge of the house of Pharaoh. And remember what we saw in the house of Potiphar and in the house of the prison. There were a few things that happened, right? We saw success. He was given success. He was given favor in his master's eyes. He was given responsibility, and his master came to trust him. Well, look at what happens here with Pharaoh. In verse 40, he's over the house of Pharaoh. He's given that responsibility. In verse 39, he's given favor in Pharaoh's eyes. In verse 40, he's trusted and given responsibility. In verse 49, he's given success. There's great abundance that comes out of this. It's all of those same things that you saw in a little bit in the house of Potiphar, and a little bit in the house of the prison. Now in the house of Pharaoh, you see all of this coming bountifully from the Lord. God is just giving in this amazing way to him. And so just consider what all of this means in the big picture of Genesis. This is as close as it gets in the book of Genesis to a king coming from the line of Abraham. This is that God promised Abraham, there are going to be descendants of yours that are kings. There is going to be a descendant who is going to rule and is going to be a blessing to all of the nations. This is as close as that gets in the book of Genesis. Later on, we'll see it more fully fulfilled in David, Solomon, and then ultimately in Jesus. But here, Joseph is acting in a way that is ruling over the land of Egypt, and in a way that is blessing all the families of the world. So it goes on to tell the story of what happens. They have the plenty, the land produces abundantly, then they have the famine that comes, and whenever it's verse 55, it says, when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph. What he says to you, do. So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened up all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, verse 57, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. So now you have Joseph here blessing and giving and preserving all the earth, all the families of the world, all the nations. I think Joseph here, we see him giving conclusions to all kinds of promises, all kinds of tensions that are in the book of Genesis. He resisted temptation where Adam failed. He is a royal seed that was promised to Adam and Eve and to Abraham. He's a blessing to all the earth. So Joseph is bringing so many of these Genesis storylines to a conclusion in his life. And all of this time, God is doing something good. God was working his plan. But boy, oh boy, was God working at his pace. This is taking so long. Verse 46 of chapter 41, Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Anyone remember how old Joseph was when his brothers sold him into Egypt? He was 17. So you're talking about 13 years of Joseph's life have now been either as a slave in Egypt or as a prisoner in Egypt before he ends up coming out and the Lord doing this through him. And that even is the beginning of the years of abundance. So we're going to see it's closer to 20 or even more years after that before he actually comes in contact with his brothers, which we'll talk about next week. But God is working at a very slow pace here. And Joseph, remember, he's blind this whole time to what God is about to do. It's taking 13 years here for God's plan to come out. But God's plan allowed Joseph to be the one through whom the world was spared from famine. His plan was even bigger than that, though. God's plan was bigger than saving the world from famine. And God ultimately had a plan to use the descendants of Abraham to save the world from a much bigger problem than famine. And that was ultimately to save the world from the biggest problem that Adam and Eve introduced, the problem of sin. So we're going to see next week in chapter 42 that it is the plan of God in this to preserve his people through whom Jesus would ultimately come. And God is working through that. I skipped over something, but I want to bring your attention back to it. In verse 32 of chapter 41, when Joseph is interpreting Pharaoh's dream, he says, the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. What other dreams in this story have been doubled, have had two parallel dreams happening? His first two dreams, right? And I can't help but wonder, as Joseph tells Pharaoh, this thing is fixed by God, it will certainly come about, it will shortly come about. Is he thinking, well, my dreams were doubled too. God will certainly bring those things about. I don't know what Joseph is thinking there, but in the narrative, we are able to look forward and say, well, God has fixed this thing, and that God is working his plan for his brothers to come and bow down to Joseph. This is something that is fixed by God, and that he will shortly bring it about. So just one last exhortation while we before you can ask any questions, but just considering in your own life, are you humbling yourself before God? Maybe it's a time of waiting, maybe it's a time of struggle and injustice in your life, or maybe it's something difficult is happening and you're blind to the future. You are blind to what God's plan may be in the long run. Are you humbling yourself before God and trusting in his plan and recognizing that his plan is better than our plan? His timing, his pace is better than our pace, because God is working his good plan at exactly the right time. And when we humble ourselves before him, we can actually live a life that pleases him in the meantime. Wherever we are, whatever circumstances we are, recognize, like we saw a couple weeks ago, if the Lord is with us, it doesn't matter if we're in the time of blessing, in the time of temptation, or in the time of struggle. If the Lord is with us, we can live lives that honor him. So I'd just exhort you this week to intentionally be humbling yourself before the Lord and his plan, and recognizing he knows better than any of us know in our lives.